name's Matt. I'm the EMS fellow currently. Just finished being a research fellow. So I'm going to be talking about tachycardias. I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible, even though this is largely trying to dump information into your brains to assimilate. Everyone whip out your camera, scan the QR code that's going to get you over to Poll Everywhere, which is how I will be attempting to manage the interactive component of this. Okay, same thing. If is the poll ever coming up?
Yeah.
Anyone having troubles? Cool. All right, so let's see if that is working. How are you feeling about EKGs? Oh, so many sad faces. Oh, that's so sad. Okay, well, hopefully we can make that better. So the main differentiation when you're talking about tachycardias is regular or irregular and wide or narrow. So we're going to go through each of those 4 boxes and talk about what the distinguishing characteristics are between the different rhythms that fit within that box. So narrow and regular. What are you thinking? Oh, you know what? I remember I messed this up last time. The screen share and Poll Everywhere doesn't show up unless I do. There we go. Okay. Looks like most people think like SVT, sinus tach, flutter. Cool. All right. So our main list is like sinus tach, atrial tach, SVT, and orthodromic AVRT. So let's go through these one by one. So sinus tach is definitely the most common one. Okay. So you've got a P before every QRS. The PR ratio is constant. And this is going to become important in a moment. The P waves are upright in 2-3 and AVF and inverted in AVR. Why do you think that matters? Bueller. Okay, so that lets us know that it's actually coming from the sinus node because it's coming from the top part of the atria and coming down. There are other foci in the atria that can fire, and those are going to have a different P axis, and we'll look at one of those in a minute. So what do you think this is? I heard SVT. Anyone want to say sinus? So this is actually sinus tach. So you can see pretty clearly here, there's a P wave, there's a P wave, there's a P wave, there's a P wave. It's a little harder to see in lead 2, but there are these little blips there before each one. Also actually pretty clear in lead 1. But this is just really, really fast sinus tach. So you really have to look for the P waves. You can't just rely on the rate. I think their heart rate here is like 196 or something. And in like a healthy young adult, they can get a sinus rate that high. So let's talk about atrial tach or ectopic atrial tachycardia. So you'll notice here, this isn't fast enough to be an ectopic atrial tach. This is just an ectopic atrial rhythm, but it'd be this bit faster. So what do you see about the P waves? What did I say before? In order for them to be sinus P waves, they need to be.
Oh, dude, it's not maybe down.
Yeah, they need to be upright in 2-3 AVF and inverted in AVR. And what are they here? Just say what the P waves look like. Down. Yeah, they're inverted. That's the fancy word for down. So they're inverted in 2-3 AVF and they're upright in AVR. So what that means is that they're starting at the bottom of the atria and coming up instead of coming from the top of the atria and going down. So the focus that's driving this rhythm is somewhere other than the sinus node, which is why this is called an ectopic atrial rhythm. And if this were faster, it would be an ectopic atrial tachycardia. Now we get into what your new reflex is, right? SVT. Specifically, this is AV nodal reentrant tachycardia. So the AV node is not just a dot that impulses travel through. The AV node has two separate pathways in it that are interconnected to form a circle. One of them is the fast pathway and one of them is the slow pathway. Now, normally, an impulse conducts down the fast pathway, doesn't make it down the slow pathway in time, and then it goes down the rest of the His bundle. The fast and the slow pathways also have different refractory periods. So if you get a beat that comes at exactly the wrong time, then it can reach the bottom of the pathway just as the other, because they flip back and forth in terms of like being available, right? So they fire and then so they fire, then the fast pathway becomes available first, and then the short pathway becomes available again afterward. So if they fire together like they're supposed to, and then an extra beat comes in just as the fast pathway is available, then it will conduct down the fast pathway while the slow pathway is still blocked. And then the slow pathway becomes available just as the fast pathway is finishing. And it picks it up and brings it back to the top, and the fast is ready, and it gets stuck in this loop. And that is AV nodal reentrant tachycardia, which you think of when you say, what you mean when you say SVT, because these are all SVTs because they're above the ventricles. So that is what's happening in AV nodal reentrant tachycardia. So what is the mechanism? What do you give for this? What's the drug? The one that scares everyone. The adenosine, right? What's the adenozine's mechanism of action? It is an AV nodal blocker, right? So it's resetting the conduction timing here by blocking them and then letting them come back online. So a run of SVT of AV-NRT is almost always triggered by a PAC because it has to come in that exact wrong time when the one pathway is available and the other is not. And then it goes down and then that becomes available and it picks it up and it gets stuck in that circus wheel motion. So this is SVT. It's narrow, it's regular, it's fast. Do you see P waves? I do. So they're right here. These are retrograde P waves. So coming back to here, every time this circuit hits the bottom, it fires the ventricle, and every time this circuit hits the top, it fires the atria. So this is a retrograde P wave. So if you look at this patient when they go into sinus rhythm afterward, that little blip, that little R prime in V1 will probably be gone. So this is a video of a patient in SVT. It's narrow. The rate is constant other than the machine seeing artifact and missing it. You see that, like it just sits at that heart rate basically. So like I mentioned, all three of these narrow regular rhythms are SVTs because they're occurring above the ventricles. Even though when you say SVT, what you mean is AV-NRT. So something slightly different is orthodromic AV-RT. Now, in this, the prerequisite for this is that you have to have an accessory pathway. So what's the main accessory pathway that you think of? Well, parts are white, yeah. So that's the condition. It's not the name of the pathway, but yeah. So what happens in orthodromic AV-RT is the impulse, instead of getting locked in a loop going around the AV node, it goes through the AV node, down and up the ventricles, back into the atria, and then back down the AV node. And this is called orthodromic because you're going along the normal conduction path of the ventricles. Now, when you go in going down the normal path of the conduction in the ventricles, you think it's going to go fast or slow? So the conduction impulses travel fast when they're going the direction they're supposed to, because this is normal conduction, right? It comes down the septum and then up the ventricles. right? That's the normal conduction. It goes fast. And because it goes fast, that's why this is narrow. If this were to be going the other way, it would be going slowly, and that would make it wide, which we'll talk about this as a wide and regular in a minute. So this is different from pre-excitation, where you get an impulse firing from the sinus node or the atria, and then it travels down both paths simultaneously. So if this were, let's say we blocked here, and this sinus impulse was just going down here, what do you think the QRS would look like? Wide, right? It would look like a PVC, but with a P wave in front of it. And if this part were blocked, oops, what would the EKG look like? It would just look normal, right? If the accessory pathway was blocked, okay? So what you get when pre-excitation is you get the start of a PVC and then the finish of a normal beat, because although it gets here first and gets to start conducting slowly while the impulse is being blocked in the AV node to create the PR interval, then this one finishes and takes over because it's so much faster. So that's why pre-excitation looks the way it does, because it's like it starts life as a PVC and then ends as a normal beat. So I'm not going to show an example of orthodromic AVRT because it is indistinguishable from AVNRT on a surface EKG. The only way that's going to clue you in is after the patient converts, you see WPW on the EKG, right? So here's that. Starts as a PVC, ends as a normal beat, and pre-excitation, right? So what do we call that? Delta wave, exactly. All right. Questions on narrow and regular? Yes.
How do you tell the participant right to be in that like after the you said it was like a 2 month after the
Yep.
minutes?
So you can see, let's see, I'm trying to find an example on here. So here, like it almost looks like just a little bit of distortion in the T wave, because look, the T wave is actually like, you see this little blip here on the side of the T wave. That lines up with that, which is what the retrograde P wave is. Because you can look in, because remember, everything that lines up vertically on the EKG is occurring at the same time. So you can look at this T wave and see like, okay, well, the T wave really starts here. And so if you come straight up, this is really where the start of the T wave is. So if that little blip wasn't there, this would probably come straight down and have this normal shape instead of this little peak right there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, narrow and irregular. So what are you thinking of with narrow and irregular? Good. AFib, fib, RVR, narrow AF. Yeah. Flutter, less flutter. Is that what that is? Oh. Good. So we're getting like fib, we're getting flutter. Good. So narrow and irregular. TACs, multifocal atrial tachycardia, AFib, and aflutter are going to be your prime suspects. So PACs, MAT, and AFib really all exist along the same spectrum. Okay, so when you have one focus in the atria that fires occasionally, you start having PACs. If it's not just one place in the atria that's firing, you have a handful, then you get more beats, and they're different morphologies because they're coming from different parts of the atria. That's MAT. And then when you have a bunch of them firing, then all of those P waves are stacking up on each other and then making this very squiggly looking line. And that's coarse atrial fibrillation. And then when everything in the atria is firing all the time, such that it's making this really fine squiggly line, because now there's so many P waves stacked on top of each other that it just looks like this very fine squiggle, that's fine AFib. So all of this stuff is along the same spectrum. So PACs here, you can see you've got, here's the, let's see here. So you can see that the PAC, actually the P wave looks slightly different than the normal beats. So this is like normal beat, PAC. That P wave looks a little bit different than this one, doesn't it? Right, and it looks different because it's coming from a different part of the atria, because it's not a sinus beat. Now, if you have enough of, so a PAC can have 3 different fates. It can either be conducted normally and look like this is what you sort of expect. It can be conducted aberrantly, or it can be blocked, not conducted at all, depending on when it occurs. This has to do, again, because the left and right bundle branches have different refractory periods. So if a PAC comes at exactly the right time, then the left bundle branch may be blocked while the right bundle branch is open, and you'll effectively have the bundle branch blocked for 1 beat. And the reverse can also happen. So here we see, so this is normal beat, PVC, normal beat. Here's the P wave. Do you see that blip on top of the T wave? So, but this beat's wide, and that's because this one is being conducted aberrantly. Now look at this T wave compared to this T wave. So there is a PAC in here that is getting blocked. So this is a blocked PAC, this is an aberrantly conducted PAC, and then this is a normally conducted PAC. So those are the 3 different things that can happen when a PAC fires. Does the bundle branch, like single beat bundle branch block thing make sense? Okay. So there's your P wave preceding that beat. Again, look at the first T wave compared to the second one. There's like a peak on it. There's another P wave that gives you a different wide looking beat. So, so your V1, so that first one, the right bundle was blocked. On the second one, the left bundle was blocked. There's your blocked beat, and then there's your normal beat. Those are all just PACs, right? They just cause the ventricular system behaves differently based on the timing. And so really the key in this is to really look at that T wave and really convince yourself that there isn't another P wave hiding on top of it. So MAT is similar because do we see distinct P waves? Yeah, one before every QRS, but there are several different morphologies. There's at least, I don't know, 3, 4. It's an arbitrary cutoff between when you start calling it MAT and when there's enough different morphologies that you can't really discern individual P waves maybe, and you start calling it AFib. But we usually what you see is like at least four different morphologies of P waves. So there's a P for every QRS. This is narrow, this is irregular, but there are multiple morphologies now. So now we've got a lot of different places firing in the atria. Now AFib, you start with something like this. This is what I would call a coarse AFib, because sometimes you're like, I don't know, like I could be convinced like maybe that's a P wave before this one, or maybe that's a P wave before this one, because there aren't as many foci firing in the atria. And so sometime, based on the timing, you're able to convince yourself you see an individual P wave. And that's because they're not firing enough that it's like completely stacked on top of each other and indiscernible. Whereas in here, you see there's so much atrial activity firing that it almost comes out to be a flat line. And that's because they're just firing constantly. And each time one of those foci in the atria fires, it's creating a P wave. But think of them as all stacking on top of each other. And if you stack a bunch of P waves next to each other, now you get this very fine little burr, 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 as you're just going over all the bumps, right? So this is, sorry? Burr, 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 burr. Yeah, okay. So that's a fine AFib. And this is another example of AFib. I don't have the presenter view because I'm using the thing, so I don't remember exactly what I wanted to say there. But so this is also just another example of AFib. So we can look at flutter. Flutter is going to be a little bit different. Flutter, instead of having all these different places firing in the atria, this is another time when impulses get stuck in a loop. Only this is happening in there are actually pathways that go through the atria to get down to the AV node, and it will get stuck in a loop going through these intraatrial pathways. Most commonly, there's a circuit that goes around the tricuspid valve, and that's most commonly the loop that they get stuck in, and that's why this is easier to ablate than AFib, because if you can figure out which pathway they're getting stuck in, you just burn off that one part, whereas in AFib, you have to burn off all the foci that are causing all of that extra firing. So, flutter, you see these flutter waves, and it can be hard to train your eye to see them. So what some people find helpful is actually turning the EKG upside down. Did they like jump out at you when I did that? Yeah. For whatever reason, your brain is not so good looking at it right side up, but as soon as you turn it upside down, it jumps out for some people, okay? So here's another example of flutter, and we'll flip it upside down. Maybe that jumps out at you more. Yeah, is that freaking you out a little bit?
A lot of these look like regular.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So flutter can be regular for long periods of time. Flutter often occurs with a 2-to-1 conduction. So even though the atrial rate is around 300, the ventricular rate will be around 150. And if it's conducting 2-to-1, because the atrial component is clockwork regular, what's going to determine whether you have a regular or irregular ventricular response is what the AV node chooses to do. So commonly it will allow through 2-to-1, so it can be narrow and regular. But you can also go, let's see here. This one you can see has some irregularity to it. So in this part, it's having variable AV block. So this one can do both. But what I wanted to highlight on this EKG is, does it look like there is inferior ST elevation? I'm not asking if there is. It's not a trick question. I'm saying, does it look like there is? Yeah. And so atrial flutter can actually be a common cause of a false positive computer interpretation of STEMI for that reason. Because this isn't ST elevation, this is just the QRS sitting on top of a flutter wave right there. So if the computer sees that, it may become confused and call it an inferior MI. Wide and regular. TAC, good. VTAC, VTAC, VTwitch, okay. Funnel branch block, SVT, VTAC, VT, VTAC, good. Right, so the first three things for wide and regular that you need to think about are VTAC, VTAC, and VTAC. Okay. Otherwise, then you get into some of the quote unquote VTAC mimics, which are kind of more tox metabolic things, and antidromic AVRT. So let's talk about VTAC, VTAC, and VTAC. So what do you see? Right. What do you see? Tell me what you see. Wide, regular, fast. Now, an important thing here, I'm going to throw out a word, monomorphic or polymorphic. Monomorphic, what does that mean? All the QRSs look the same. That's all it means, okay? Now, there's lots of different like algorithm stuff you'll see for trying to determine whether something is VTAC or SVT with a Baron C or SVT with a bundle branch block. It is a fool's errand to try and rule out VTAC. What you need to be worrying about, particularly as an emergency doctor, is ruling in VTAC. Now, there are several things that you can do to rule in VTAC. One is called AV dissociation. So here you see P waves intermixing with different parts of the ventricular complexes. So that means that the atria and the ventricles are dissociated AV dissociation confirms the diagnosis of VTAC. Okay, you can also get what's called a capture beat. So here we have a P wave that then fires a different looking QRS complex, and then it goes back into the wider complex rhythm. So this is a capture beat, meaning the atria during a break managed to get a normally conducted impulse down. Okay. And then you can also get what's called a fusion complex, which is what this guy is. So fusion complex is kind of like in that pre-excitation we were talking about, where you have the normal beat and a ventricular beat that are occurring at the same time and merging to create a different appearing QRS complex. So the presence of any one of those three things, AV dissociation, capture beats, or fusion complexes, rules in the diagnosis of VTAC. There is no algorithm magic that can reliably rule out VTAC. So after you have thoroughly convinced yourself through whatever means that this is not VTAC, then we're looking at hyperkalemia, sodium channel blockade. Now, here are the things that I would want you to consider it being not VTAC. One is the rate is too slow. So we're talking VTAC should be at least like 130, 140, okay? If it's slower than that, as it is here, this is about 100, that's sus, as I think you kids say. So the other one is if the QRS is too wide, so more than one big box, 200 milliseconds, that's also sus. So here we see both of these. It's slow, about 100 beats a minute, and it's wider than one big box, which makes you think more of that tox metabolic. Okay, I believe that one's hyperkalemia. But this is when you're starting to think about, should I get an ISTAT? Am I going to give empiric bicarb to try and see if it narrows? So the reason that sodium channel blockade and hyperkalemia look similar are because sodium or potassium is essentially a sodium channel poison. So it creates sodium channel blockade. Okay, and then what's sort of like the other classic thing in terms of sodium channel blockers? TCAs, right? Which is why, you know, pushing up bicarb, see if it does anything. Okay, you can use it diagnostically at that point. Now, antidromic AVRT. What is the prerequisite for being able to have antidromic AVRT? Hint, it's the same prerequisite for having orthodromic AVRT. Yeah, you have to have an accessory pathway. So in antidromic AVRT, it's starting in the atria, going down the ventricles, retrograde along the His-Purkinje system, the His bundle branch system, back up the wrong way through the AV node, and then back down the atria, the ventricle. So it is going against the normal direction of conduction in these specialized fibers. And so do you think that occurs faster or slower than if it were going the right way? Slower, which means that this is going to be wide or narrow. Wide, right? Because time is the x-axis. So again, this is going to be effectively indiscernible on surface EKG from VTAC. So you will treat it as such. So just a reminder about that pre-excitation where you get the retrograde beat and the normal beat firing at the same time, and they fuse, giving us that pre-excitation. So the pickup here, you're still going to treat it like VTAC, but then after you get the patient out of the rhythm, if they have pre-excitation afterward, then that is what's going to make you think that maybe this was actually antidromic AVRT. The other thing is if you have, that I would kind of think about antidromic is if the patient is like a healthy young person, they're completely stable in this wide complex rhythm, and they're perhaps flipping in and out of narrow complex tachycardias and wide complex tachycardias, because that's just them flipping between orthodromic and antidromic reentry. Wide and irregular. These are the scary ones, okay? Here be dragons. So what are you thinking with wide and irregular? VFib does not have QRS complexes. It is, however, very irregular. Barency, torsades, fib. Torsades, good. Okay. So when you get into the wide and irregular, it can be something as benign as atrial fibrillation with a bundle branch block, or something as scary as AFib with WPW or torsades. Okay, but 2 out of 3 of them are like very serious, and 1 of them is meh, which is why I say here be dragons, especially when you're trying to differentiate them. So AFib plus a bundle branch block. The difficulty here is, I mean, what does that look like? What's your reflex? VTAC. Are there parts of it where it is irregular, however?
Sure. Yeah.
Look right here. So VTAC should be clockwork regular, but you watch this, just on this 10-second strip, you can see there's portions of it where it's irregular. And that makes VTAC exceedingly unlikely. Also, this patient is going to be stable, right? Because it's just AFib. Also, I really hope that you can find a identical looking bundle branch block on their previous EKG. Okay. So AFib with WPW, this is the one, right? Okay. So the problem with AFib and WPW is that you've got this accessory pathway, right? So AFib, what's the normal job of the AV node? What does it do?
Slow down.
It slows conductions from the atria to ventricles. But now we've got this wide open rogue pathway that is going to allow stuff to go through without any of that, right? So the problem when you've got AFib with WPW is that it is because you've got that accessory pathway, the AFib has no inhibition going down to trigger VFib. So what don't you give this patient? Any calcium channel blocker, right? Or AV nodal blocker. So is this monomorphic or polymorphic? Polymorphic, right? They all look different. Would you ever look at this EKG and immediately think, I'm gonna try adenosine? No. So here's the thing. If your patient has orthodromic or antidromic conduction and they're in that normal loop, it is completely safe to give the patient adenosine because they don't have AFib that is coming through. If you take this patient and you give them that AV nodal blocker, now all those impulses are going to be dumped down the accessory pathway that doesn't slow anything down, and then the AFib becomes VFib, right? That's clean kill. So in that, when you're stuck in that loop though, if you block the AV node, you break the loop and you cease the rhythm. There's no magic underlying mess that's going to come dumping onto the ventricles in that situation. And that's why ACLS says that you just give it, right? For narrow complex and regular or wide complex and regular, if stable, you can diagnostically attempt adenosine because it's safe, even if the patient has underlying WPW. It is only this where it is completely unsafe to give the patient an AV nodal blocker. But I don't think any of you looked at this and thought, oh, I'm gonna get him some adenosine, right? Like, it's... All right, finishing up with torsades, polymorphic VTAC. Twisting of the points. So you've got these complexes, and some of them, they look like they're kind of pointed up here, and then some of them, they kind of look like they're pointed down here. This is also a polymorphic VTAC because there is more than one morphology of the QRS complexes. This is a much better looking example. So the difference between polymorphic VTAC and torsades, it is torsades only if the patient has an underlying long QT. Otherwise, it's just polymorphic VTAC, right? It's just sparkling VTAC, you know, it's not actually torsades. So you can see the patient's got a long QT over here. And so this is truly torsades. This one, you can't really tell what the QT interval is going into it, but this is a polymorphic VTAC, okay? So those are your 4 different categories, how you differentiate between them and kind of how you differentiate between the ones like within each category. Questions? Or just bewildered?